In the aftermath of the First Crusade, 4 Christian kingdoms were established in the Near East. Today, we're going to explore the history of the Crusader States and the many myths that surround them.
Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe.
Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli and Jerusalem. 4 Christian kingdoms all established after 1098. The popular image of these kingdoms is as fortified outposts, ruling over poor and often barren lands where they were treated as an occupying force. Yet the reality of the Crusader states is far more complex. The states were often in political conflict with themselves or newcomers from the west as much as their perceived enemies. They had a love-hate relationship with the Byzantines to their north, the Muslim rulers on their borders, and eventually both the Mamluks and the Mongols. They were also, at times, vibrant and multicultural kingdoms, thanks to the nature of the trade routes and geography over which they sat. Kingdoms that were not necessarily guaranteed to fail. Indeed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would survive in some form for almost 200 years. To help me explore this subject today on the pod is Nick Morton. Nick, say hello.
Hi Gareth, it's great to be on the show. Thank you for inviting me.
Delighted to have you here. So for those unfamiliar with Nick's work, Nick is an associate professor at Nottingham Trent University. He specializes in medieval Middle Eastern history and is the author of Mongol Storm, which looks at the Mongol invasions of the Middle East from multiple perspectives. More recently, he's also the author of Crusader Storm, which takes the same approach but for the 12th century. He's also being very polite and not mentioning the fact that he's one of my favorite authors on a subject very dear to my heart, which is medieval holy orders, military holy orders. So you will absolutely be coming back on the pod at some point, Nick, to cover those with me as well.
Happy to.
But thank you for coming on. But just before we get into it today, a quick shout out to Griff from Northern Ireland. He is one of our supporters at insider level, and it's supporters like Griff who help us keep this podcast going. You can become an insider yourself, which includes your own shout out at untitled-history.com, as well as some other benefits we'll talk about later. But before then, we have some Crusader states to talk about. And Nick, one of the reasons I wanted to get you on is not just because of your own writings in the past on this, but also because with Crusader Storm, you've done what you did with the previous book, which is look at these things from multiple perspectives. And I think that's the thing with these states, isn't it? Is you have to look at them in the round and from a wider perspective than just almost this view of them as crusaders going out there to conquer Jerusalem.
Yes, that's right. So when you talk to people about the history of the Crusades or the medieval Middle East, often the one thing that they think they know with absolute certainty is you can take a map of the Middle East for this period, draw a line down the middle and write Christian territory or Crusader territory on one side and Muslim territory on the other, and then they fight. And this isn't what was happening. Yes, the First Crusade established a series of territories in the coastal regions of the Middle East, but there are lots of other factions and societies and empires and emirates in play. They've all got their own agendas, they've all got their own interests, they've all got their own natural allies and enemies. The battle lines are rarely simple, and it's a much more complex and entangled history than people think. And it's trying to draw out that diversity, that interconnectedness of the Middle East at this time. That really was a key thought behind writing a history of the Crusades in the 12th century.
And I think that's the thing I hope listeners come away with at the end of this episode is I hope your listeners end up with a really good understanding that this is a really vibrant and constantly shifting period that involves a lot of shifting political alliances, both within the states and also, as we mentioned, like, there is this massive frenemy relationship, particularly for certain kingdoms, with the Byzantines to the north. We'll touch on how that really comes into play for Antioch at some point. But let's maybe start, I think, with the geography and the trade of the region, because this all starts to kick off in about 1098. Nick, politically, what is the atmosphere that when that First Crusade is departing, because we won't get in too much to what that crusade looks like, when that when that crusade is underway, and then when it starts to finish, so let's say in 1098, what is the geopolitical environment in which these states are existing?
Yeah, so when the Crusaders begin to approach the Middle East, well, for a start, they have virtually no idea where they're going. There have been pilgrims, sometimes quite large pilgrim groups that have been to the Middle East before. But for many people, their main point of reference when it comes to the geography of the region is the Bible, or indeed late classical authors. They've got virtually no recent information about what the Middle East looks like or who they'll find there. Knowledge is very patchy about the cultures or religions of the region. There's even one account of pilgrims getting about halfway through Germany and saying, okay, we've been going for a long time. Where's Jerusalem then? There's no maps. The first maps that have survived that look anything like the actual contours and outline of the Mediterranean or Western Europe or the Middle East, they come from the 13th century. They're a long way ahead. At this point, maps show virtually no general knowledge at all. It's simply a question of, we know we have to get to Jerusalem. We know that involves going past places like Constantinople. So we'll ask people which roads go in that direction and head off towards the horizon. So they know very little about the area. And then when they get to the Middle East, the first Crusaders discover that the Middle East is already in the it's a war zone, and it's been a war zone for a while. And the background to this is that the Middle East has experienced and just undergone one of the biggest fault lines in Eurasian history, going back not just to the medieval period, but thousands of years before. And that is the danger of invasion out of the Central Asian steppe region. So I'm going to carry you away from the Middle East for a minute to the vast grass seas of Central Asia. And as is well known, there are nomadic peoples who move from area to area, from their winter to summer grazing. And for the most part, they'll do that perfectly peacefully until suddenly they don't. And the threat that the nomadic peoples of Central Asia will weld themselves into a confederation and then attack the agricultural societies around their margins, that is historic. That is why the Chinese went to such enormous lengths to fortify their northern frontiers, the most obvious example of that being the Great Wall of China. That's why the Muslim world has a series of big fortress cities along the line of the Sirdaria or Oxus River. That's why the Roman Empire experienced the invasions of the Huns, among others. This is a reoccurring phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon that's very easy to forget because we don't tend to run down the street screaming the nomads are coming anymore. But actually, that's quite a recent development. In the past, that's quite common. And the Middle East has just gone through a massive invasion out of the Central Asian steppe. And that was by a group of peoples called the Seljuk Turks from roughly Turkmenistan, that kind of area, or areas slightly to the east, perhaps. And the Seljuk Turks conquered Persia, that's modern-day Iran, much of Iraq, most of Syria. They invaded the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey. And then they pushed south, trying to conquer Egypt. But there they were held. And so when the Crusaders arrive, they encounter a situation where the Seljuk Turks, who've only been there for about 20 years, are in charge over most of the territory. But there are local populations just itching for a chance to rise up in rebellion, not against the Crusaders, against the Turks. There are also the empires that have been able to hold the Seljuk Turks out, or at least not lose all their territory to them. The Byzantine Empire, which is just another name for the Eastern Roman Empire, has lost by this stage most of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and it was the Byzantines asking for help against the Turks that, at least in part, prompted the First Crusade to be launched in the first place. And then further south, in Egypt, you have the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia Islamic caliphate, and they too have been able to hold a line against the Seljuk Turks, and that frontier line runs straight through the middle of Jerusalem, just to make things more complicated. And so this is the map. You have several small societies trying to hold out against this rapidly expanding Seljuk Empire, and the Crusaders encounter this world. And their major opponent from a very early stage is the Seljuk Turks. But just to make things just a little bit more complicated, the Seljuk Turks sultan, called Sultan Malik Shah, was assassinated a few years before the First Crusade, following which the Seljuk Empire descended into civil war. So this is the map. The Seljuk Empire controls most of the territory, but it's broken up and fragmented and fighting amongst itself. The big question is, who's going to be the next sultan? There's the Byzantine Empire, looking to rebuild its position in Anatolia and hoping it can use the Crusaders to that effect. And then there's the Fatimid Egyptians, wanting to regain their stake in much of Syria, wanting to resist the Seljuk Turks and wondering if the Crusaders provide a way of doing that.
And on top of that, it's worth us considering why everyone is so interested in this particular area. And this is back to, again, breaking that myth of the idea that this is barren and uninteresting terrain. I always think, like, you watch a film like Kingdom of Heaven, and half the time these are people marching through deserts. These are not desert environments that this is operating in. There is desert to the east, and that's acting as a blocker in some ways on where you can invade and how you can invade the area. But this is area, yes, it's often sparse when it comes to water supplies, but it's actually producing goods in its own way. And it's also become a bit of a nexus for trade routes coming in, hasn't it? So these are not often, a lot of these cities and the places we're talking about here, these are already potentially quite rich places due to what they're producing and what they can offer as trade hubs, aren't they?
Yeah. So the landscape's very variable. Egypt, of course, is fairly arid except for the Nile Delta, which has enormous agricultural wealth. But further north, along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, the vegetation becomes thicker as the further you go north, until once you get to sort of the turning point where it turns into the coast of southern Turkey, it's quite thickly forested. Some of the northern Crusader states have very lush vegetation, so you're right. It's a much more complicated landscape. But you've also touched there on something that I find, for me, this is one of my big motivations for studying this period. And that's just how many cultures are represented in this area, not just Middle Eastern societies, but societies from much further afield. And so perhaps if you'll allow me a slight digression, let's take the port of Acre, or Acre as it is today. And this is the Crusaders' biggest port. And they conquered it in 1104. A lot of the goods that they get from Western Europe go through Acre. So, Acre is a massive fortified city. Within its walls, you have people playing chess, which is a game imported from India with its origins in the 7th century Gupta Empire. People are eating from services of Chinese ceramics imported via the Silk Roads from Central Asia and China and Northern India. You've got traders arriving from the north, from the Black Sea region, bringing furs and amber. You have people in Acre, let's say the Franks or Crusaders, and they're wearing jewelry of a kind that is familiar to the Byzantine Empire. Frankish women are wearing makeup, not something that's commonly worn in Western Europe, particularly kohl, which is sort of dark eye makeup. You've got people eating all sorts of different foods, parrotfish from the Red Sea, recipes from Egypt, Georgian flatbreads, ways of preparing meat or pastry from Turkish cultures, ultimately from Central Asia. There's also the arrival in this period of rice, not well known before this, but that too becomes part of the diet. Interestingly, one of the few things the Crusaders don't eat or don't want from the local cuisine, they adopt a lot, is bread. And actually, it's something I've noticed in a lot of contexts. Lots of cultures enjoy trying other cultures' food, but often they like keeping their own bread. There seems to be something in that. But similarly, we've got a cookbook from a neighboring Kurdish culture, from the Ayyubid Empire, that's Saladin's empire, and they borrowed recipes from the Crusaders. They enjoy a Frankish roast, as it was known. And the word eel, because of course Western Europeans love eels, that word too finds its way into local languages. So much is being shared, so much is being exchanged. You've got woolen fabrics arriving from Western Europe to be exchanged with silks and cotton and linen garments from Egypt and further afield. And then, of course, we have the spice routes from Southeast Asia, bringing cardamom, cinnamon, pepper, the spices that are so famous for so many diets in this period, particularly if you're wealthy. And those too are available in Acre. You've got innovations taking place. So going back to the port of Acre, all those ships arriving, because of the Crusades, because the naval routes from southern Europe to the Middle East became so important for establishing and supporting the states created by the Crusaders, the ships get a lot bigger. And so you have ships in this period which are capable of holding up to 1,000 people, if not more, which is huge. And if you think about the evolutionary diagram of ships, they tend to show them sort of getting bigger over time, and yet they're producing some massive ships in the 12th century of a size that you probably won't be getting before the Napoleonic Wars. Maybe a little bit before that, but not much. So there too, there's an awful lot of innovation and development taking place. Ideas are changing hands. I think my favorite story of sort of reflecting this exchange of cultures is, we'll put it this way, Gareth. Would you like to know what to do if you're bitten by a leopard?
I mean, it's one of those bits of information that if you happen to be near a leopard is going to become very, very important at that time. So I would call it circumstantial information, but very, very critical circumstantial information. So yeah, what do I do if I'm bit by a leopard?
To be fair, what I'm about to say isn't going to help you if you are bitten by a leopard. This is not genuine medical advice. Anyway, the story goes like this. So according to Assyrian text, if you're bitten by a leopard, you've got to be careful, because what's going to happen next is inevitably mice are going to want to urinate on the wound. I mean, why wouldn't they? In which case, you'll probably die. So if you're bitten by a leopard, the most important thing to do is to get onto a boat and go out onto a body of water the mice can't follow you. But even then, it's still not certain, so you should really station cats around the edge of that lake or sea or whatever, just to make sure the mice can't get to you. Even then, there are still further steps you have to take, because the mice may hollow out pomegranates and paddle them after you, because obviously they have this magnetic attraction to your leopard bite. Now, why have I told you this odd story about leopard bites? The answer is simple. It appears in a Syrian text from the 12th century. Also appears in a text produced near Bristol in the Kingdom of England. And here's my point. Things are changing hands. Stories, ideas, medicines, foods, textiles, technologies, games, all sorts of things. And the Middle East is the fulcrum for that exchange. That's where things, whether from the Middle East or from further afield, that's where they change hands, or at least in many cases. And that's why I find the Middle East so fascinating. And these are themes I really wanted to bring out in my books.
This is what I really want us to get across today. Listeners, if you're expecting this to be a sort of, and in this year, this battle happened, and in this year, this battle happened, we'll do that in a future podcast. I feel like it's really, really important before you talk about that to really understand what these regions were like, what it was like in that area, because otherwise you come to those perceptions of the battles, the conflicts, with a misapprehension of why people are doing what they're doing. And I mean, like, there's so many little things I love about this. I mean, obviously, in my own study of the Knights Hospitaller, one of the things I always love encountering is the newcomer effect. So effectively, the outsiders coming into these states, where obviously the military holy orders have a strong and increasingly strong presence as the period goes on. But you almost get the equivalent of the same thing you'd get in like letters from Roman troops back from the northern border, where you get people arriving and discovering that their impression of the area is very different from what the area is. So you get letters back from people who are like, Mum, I went over there expecting to vanquish the infidel, and I went out and tried to vanquish some infidels, and a bunch of my fellow brother knights told me to quit that, please, because it's disturbing the peace, and actually that guy that I'm raging against is actually the guy who builds our castles, and he's reported me for doing it, and now can we back off a bit? It like you can feel the almost the sort of the zealotry changing. That doesn't mean there isn't any of that, but it just means it's far more complex than you might think from what we get presented in the media. Now, I think within that context, and maybe it's a good way of doing this, is we should try and give people within this episode a bit of an overview of the four kingdoms themselves. And maybe Edessa is the place to start, precisely because the way the Crusaders almost come to power in that is because of the cultural mix in Edessa at the time, isn't it?
Yes. So as the First Crusade advances into northern Syria, so southern Anatolia, northern Syria, they receive an appeal for help from the Armenian Christian population, or largely Armenian Christian population, of the city of Edessa, which is an inland city. And they have been engaged in a long-term sort of struggle with the advancing Seljuk Turks, and so the Crusaders represent a natural ally for them. Crusaders arrive, help defend the city, and then through a series of political maneuverings that aren't entirely clear and are told rather differently, the Crusaders end up in charge of Edessa and thereby create the first Crusader state. And that's the term. It's a modern term, so no one called it that at the time. It's a modern term for one of the territories established by the Crusaders. And around this time, they're also besieging a northern Syrian city called, it's in southern Turkey now actually, of Antioch. And once they've conquered that with a very brutal siege and massacre, Antioch becomes another Crusader state. Then they advance south towards their end goal, which is Jerusalem. As is well known, they conquer Jerusalem again with a very brutal siege in 1099. And a few years later, another Crusade commander conquers the city of Tripoli, a little bit further north. It's in modern-day northern Lebanon. And that then becomes the county of Tripoli, and that's the fourth Crusader state. So those are the four mainland Crusader states, and to put it very broadly, they spend the next 25, 30 years expanding, trying to push along the coast, conquering the ports that will open up routes to Western Europe, and those routes will then funnel in settlers, mercenaries, traders, the people they need to make their territories work. And they also push inland, but here they're held. They try to conquer the big inland cities of Aleppo, Damascus, or ultimately Cairo in Egypt, but on those occasions they fail. And so that's the high water mark of the Crusades. While that's going on, the Seljuk Empire is continuing to disintegrate, but other dynasties rise from amidst the ruins of the Seljuk Empire, most prominently a dynasty called the Zangids. And the first major Zangid ruler, called Zangi, he is perhaps best known for destroying the county of Edessa, or conquering the city of Edessa, in 1144, which then prompts the Second Crusade, which isn't particularly, it doesn't really achieve very much, from the Crusaders' perspective anyway. Following that, Zangi's son, Nur al-Din, expands his empire, conquers Damascus, becomes ruler of much of Syria, and famously also sends forces to Egypt, which destroy the Fatimid Caliphate and establish that under his rule. And his lieutenant in that venture is Saladin, who is very well known. When Nur al-Din dies, Saladin then reconquers his former master's empire, disenfranchising his former master's descendants and making a huge empire in its own right. And he then turns that empire on a series of enemies, including the Crusader States, which he then defeats decisively in 1187, and then he conquers or reconquers Jerusalem a few months later. So that's a sort of a whistle-stop tour of the major sort of elements in this conflict. The problem with telling the story a bit like that is it makes it sort of appear that there's sort of a Crusader bloc and there's a Muslim bloc on the other side of the frontier. In practice, there's plenty of occasions when there's Christians and Muslims on both sides of the battlefield, and I haven't even mentioned the interventions of the Byzantine Empire or the Cilician Armenians or the Bedouin, who are frequently on the Crusaders' side, as indeed are the Fatimid Egyptians for much of the later part of their history.
Antioch is a really good example of just how complex the relationship with the Byzantines is. Because obviously Antioch is a major Byzantine stronghold city for a long period. Then, as you say, the Seljuk Turks rock up, 1084, they siege it, they take it. And when that First Crusade arrives, it's effectively on condition that once they capture Antioch, they're going to return it to the Byzantine Empire. That's the deal that's been struck. And we can talk about why Antioch's so hard to take in a bit, but it takes the Crusaders a long time to do it. They place it under siege in 1097. They finally take it, I think it's June 1098, is it, before they manage to finally take it? And that they do in a bit of a rush because they know there's a Muslim relief force coming in. So they almost then end up being besieged in the city they've just taken. So there's a lot of back and forth over Antioch. But most importantly, the Byzantine emperor does not march to relieve the city once the Crusaders are in it. And the Crusaders take that as a bit of an excuse to turn around and go, well, actually, you've just voided our deal. We're not giving you this city back. And then for the duration of its existence as a state, Antioch is in a constant state of either being friendly with the Byzantines, being a direct enemy of the Byzantines, being periodically at war with the Byzantines sometimes helping it in war. I think even briefly it becomes back again a vassal, in theory, of the Byzantine state. It's an incredibly complex relationship, and that's just true of all of these cities, isn't it? They're all in these flowing, changing relationships with all of the states around them.
Yeah, and they're in dialogue not just with each other, but also with their pasts. So the reason Antioch's so hard to take is because it's got some massive classical walls that were built hundreds of years previously. And Antioch's history is fascinating. Yes, it was conquered by the Crusaders in 1098. Before that, it was briefly held by the Seljuk Turks. Before that, it was a Byzantine or Eastern Roman city. The Olympic Games were held there for a time. It's the city where the name Christian was first coined, and it goes way back before Christianity into the years before that. So all these places, all these locations have deep histories, and often those histories reappear in unexpected ways to shape their development in the centuries of this era. So that intersection, not just between different cultures in the medieval period, but also the influence of their pasts, it's always there. And you can see it in the construction of Crusader castles, because the Middle East then, as now, is covered with the remains of Roman temples or baths or colonnades or theatres or fortifications or roads. And many societies treat these things like Lego bricks. And why wouldn't you? When Saladin wanted to build, actually it wasn't Saladin, it was his descendant, wanted to build up the city of Bosra and build a new citadel, he took a Roman theatre, filled in all the arches and turned it into a fortress. And it makes perfect sense to do that because it's a great deal easier than building a castle from scratch. And if you look at the castle of Sidon on the coast, just off the coast of the town of Sidon in today it's in modern day Lebanon, you can see that the wall has all sorts of classical pillars in it that have to be laid on their side and used as building blocks. So even the nature of the buildings themselves represent that past. And we hear examples too, that when the foundations are being built for Crusader castles, they find, in some cases, fossilized fish or plants from thousands of years previously, or indeed they find coins from the Iron Age or Bronze Age. So they too are aware of the deep history underpinning what they're doing. We tend to think about the Crusades as being a long way in our past, and they are. but they've also got a past a long way behind them, which they're also aware of.
And I mean, we'll talk briefly about it towards the end of the main part of the episode, but the Battle of Hattin, the critical part that sort of is the turning point towards the downfall. I mean, a lot of that will take place in what is effectively the remains of an Iron Age fort. As you say, there's just layers of history, and those layers of history, the layers of trade have contributed to this really, really complex area that is constantly in flux. Listeners, whatever your image is of a Crusader state, hopefully what you're getting from this is it's completely different from what you might feel is represented often in the media. And we see that very much, even just within their interactions with the West. There's two things we should absolutely touch on in this context. We've talked a lot about trade. We've talked about the ships and the size of the ships. It's worth noting, listeners, that what's also hugely influential in a lot of this, as you would expect when trade is involved, is we're also in the era where the Italian naval states are really coming to the fore. So your Genoas, your Pisas, your Venice, they're doing vast amounts of shipping. They're taking actually their own little slices of these places, often in return for their help with the Crusades. They're motivated to take part in the Crusades by religious zeal, but they're also motivated by the fact that it opens up vast trade routes for them at the same time. And their support will become critical actually in holding a lot of this territory at times, because they can resupply from sea, but it will also be hugely influential in how some of these places develop and what comes out of them and the flow of people to them as well. And I think maybe it's worth us talking briefly about, we've talked about these places almost growing up, but it's the Franks really that we're talking about as the people who are in charge of this area. And it's probably worth us talking a little bit about what does the ruling class look like in these states?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that with a story, if that's all right.
Oh, you go for it.
It sort of strikes at sort of the core of what you were saying. And it's one of my favorite stories regarding the history of the Crusades, because it both reflects and challenges what everyone thinks they know about them. And the story goes like this. I think it's about 1111. And an army from the Principality of Antioch, that's one of the northernmost Crusader states, advances on the Syrian town of Shaizar. Shaizar is unusual because it's still under Arab Muslim rule. One of the very, very few towns still under Arab rule. Nearly everywhere else is under Turkish rule or under Frankish rule. So, the Frankish army advances on Shaizar, lays siege, and it all goes horribly wrong for them, and very right for the people of Shaizar. And the people of Shaizar become aware the Crusader position is collapsing, and so they advance out from beyond their walls as soon as they learn that the Frankish army is withdrawing, because their hope is to turn the withdrawal of this army into a rout. And it all takes place under cover of darkness, and the fighting's intense until one Christian knight steps out from the ranks and holds off the army of Shaizar for long enough for his fellows to get out and withdraw to the nearby town of Apamea. Now, so far, I've given you a story from the Crusades that's exactly what everyone expects. Christians and Muslims fighting each other. It gets a bit more complicated after that, because that same night, a few days later, arrives outside the town of Shaizar and says to the ruling family called the Banu Munkid that he was really impressed with how they fought during their recent battle. Could he come and train with them for a few days? And the Banu Munkid is incredibly hospitable and says, well, yes, absolutely, we'd be delighted if you could. So in he goes, he trains with them, presumably receives their hospitality and goes home. Now, I like this story because the first part panders to everyone's expectations about the Crusades. The second part challenges them. This is not what people expect. Yes, holy war is one of the causes of conflict, although other causes of conflict can be family rivalries, trade, population movements, or just sheer opportunism, among other things. But also, even in cases where holy war is being fought, it's not carried out in the way that everyone expects. I mean, even, for example, during the Third Crusade, many years later, where you have Richard I of England fighting Saladin, there's plenty of occasions where you have Crusader authors describing Muslim individuals very positively. And there's plenty of occasions when you have Muslim writers describing Christian individuals very positively. Richard I knighted several of Saladin's emirs without any pressure to do so. In the same vein, you have Saladin being incredibly courteous and showing tremendous mercy to some of the Frankish, particularly Frankish women who sort of come under his power or seek his help during this campaign. My point is, it is not necessarily what people expect. Even in cases of holy war, yes, you have massacres, yes, you have plenty of violence, but there's also a surprisingly large amount of scope for people to show respect or even to socialize or establish friendships. And I think that it comes down to a different way of conceptualizing war. Today, I mean, just imagine, pick any war going on in the world today, and imagine the combatant parties socializing with one another after the battle. I mean, it would look very odd to a modern point of view. It might even look like treachery. Not the same in the medieval period, because conducting wars is how elite men demonstrate their authority and masculinity. And so a long rambling war lasting for 20 years isn't pointless in their view. It's just perpetually giving them the chance to show off their values of authority and heroism and skill at arms and mercy. And the rival faction, whether we're looking at this from Arab, Turkish, Byzantine, or Western European perspective, they see war in broadly the same terms. And they can admire these qualities in each other. And so in some ways, warfare has something of the flavor of, let's say, an exceptionally violent form of sport. Yes, people can be killed. Yes, if they conquer a city, it can turn brutal. I don't want to play down the violence. At the same time, there's plenty of scope for exchange, friendship, interaction, and even socialization between the fighting classes. And the corollary to this is once you get below the fighting classes to everyone else, the 95% of people who aren't fighting all these big wars, there's virtually no cultural boundaries at all. And just, you mentioned before, Crusader castles. I mean, Crusader castles aren't just built by Crusaders. If let's say, the King of Jerusalem wants a castle built, what he'll do is he'll put the word out that he will need all the various technicians and artisans and laborers to make that function. And those people will arrive from all over the place, from Muslim territory, Byzantine territory, Armenian territory, and yes, from Frankish or Western European territory. And they'll all bring their different techniques, practices, ideas along with them. And so the workforces for these castles are incredibly multicultural, which is why some Crusader castles manifest architectural styles that are distinctively Islamic or Armenian or Byzantine. And the same thing goes if, let's say, the Emir of Damascus wants to build a palace, or the Sultan of the Anatolian Seljuks wants to build new castle walls, or the Armenians want to build a church, or Principality of Antioch wants to build a harbour. They all manifest an incredible sort of cross-cultural mixing of influences. And historians have interpreted this in different ways. Some people talk about this as theft, stealing architectural styles from neighbouring powers. I don't see it that way at all. They're hiring multicultural workforces, and they're looking for anyone who can do this well. They don't particularly care what religion or culture they're from, provided they can do the job. This is about a job of work. And so obviously, architectural styles will appear in all sorts of different contexts. Again, it requires a leap in understanding from the modern day, where, of course, engineering styles or technological secrets are sort of these incredibly heavily guarded things, protected by 300 meters of concrete, massive steel blast doors and zombies, presumably. It's not the case in the medieval period. Ideas and technologies flow very freely. Another great example of this that my colleague Mike Fulton has pointed out is that siege catapults, counterweight trebuchets, appear in Saladin's armies and the armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem virtually simultaneously. And I have no trouble interpreting that because siege engineers, like other forms of technicians, are available for hire. They cross cultural borders following the work. And so obviously, if someone has a good idea, that's going to appear in multiple societies almost simultaneously. There's no real point trying to work out who was more innovative or who was more sophisticated. Western Europeans, Byzantium, Muslim societies, which one was more advanced? Now, these are questions that are incredibly politically charged today, but in the medieval period, people are crossing cultural borders the whole time, taking their ideas with them.
That's why I really, really want us to, when we get to the extra bit listeners, subscribers, you're going to get us geeking out about the cultural bleed over you get in castles in this period, as well as some other things, because Crusader period castles are fascinating for all the reasons Nick's just said. We've not even talked about builders' marks and what they tell us about things, but also, listeners, if you want to hear about weird castles built into the side of hills, then we will be talking about that in the extra bit. But I think for the main bit, hopefully, listeners, what you're coming away from with this is a feel for the area now, a feel for what goes on in this period for many, many years, and that constant bleed, both culturally, technologically, and in trading terms between these kingdoms. What we should finish with in the main section, though, is, and you've kind of touched on this a bit with the talk of catapults, is we should give listeners a bit of a summary about what changes to bring this all to an end. So you've got this constant back and forth, you've got this ebb and flow. It's really once we start to get towards the rise of Saladin and also the arrival later on of the more stronger Mamluk powers and the Mongols, isn't it? That almost becomes the end of this, and it becomes the end almost by bringing it back to something you mentioned at the very, very beginning of this podcast, which is those horsemen are back, and those horsemen have very different ideas about what should go on in the area.
Yeah, so there's two major sort of moments of decline or fall for the Crusader States. The first one takes place in 1187 or the 1180s, when Saladin puts together a huge conglomeration of territory and substantially reduces but does not destroy the Crusader States. The Crusader States are then rebuilt in the 13th century, which is when the Mongols come on the scene, and eventually the Crusader States are destroyed in their entirety, on the mainland at least, between the 1260s and early 1290s by the Mamluk Empire of Egypt. But you asked about why that happened, and so in Crusader Storm, my most recent book, I'm looking more at the 12th century, and the reason Saladin is able to ultimately to retake Jerusalem and defeat the Crusader States. It's an interesting equation, because the Crusader States are not destroyed or substantially damaged during a time of weakness. Not really. They're going from strength to strength. International trade's picking up, their fortresses are getting bigger, their populations are rising, right up to the point when Saladin is able to defeat them. The key turning point for me, I've always thought, is largely Saladin's enormous empire. The Crusader States are growing, rising, becoming more powerful, but Saladin is doing those same things faster. And I think for me, the crucial factor in this is, if you put it really, really bluntly, Egypt's greatest asset for any ruler is its enormous wealth. You can get more money in revenue from Egypt than you can from any other region anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East. It's the wealthiest spot. Yes, Constantinople is very wealthy, but Egypt is the epicenter of trade from sub-Saharan Africa. It's a key market for the Indian Ocean or spice routes trade. Goods reach there from the Silk Roads or the Amber routes through the Black Sea region, or indeed from the Mediterranean. It has enormous wealth. So you've got wealth from Egypt. And then in Syria, which Saladin is able to conquer between the 1170s and early 1180s, Syria is home to very, very large Turkmen nomadic communities, which have a lot of warriors, and they are available for hire. They are very much interested in serving in large armies. They expect to be paid. And so when Saladin starts off with Egypt, but then conquers Syria, you have an important combination: enormous wealth with a huge resource of hireable soldiery. And I'm oversimplifying, but that for me is the critical connection. When large numbers of effective troops are connected with large amounts of money, and you have a ruler dynamic enough to hold those two in tension, then you have a recipe for very, very large armies. And those large armies will be the root of why Saladin is able ultimately to invade and defeat the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, as we said, isn't unified when it's invaded by Saladin's forces, but it's still able to put together some of the biggest armies at any point in its history, just not as big as Saladin's armies coming across the border.
I think that you've captured it nicely there. Is, in a way, Saladin is doing better what the Crusader States had done in the first place to be able to get there, which is marshal that combination of troops and wealth coming in, often in the Crusader States terms, particularly in the later period, wealth that is coming initially from the Templars, from the Hospitaller, that they're bringing in their vast wealth, and that's why they become more and more relied on in those periods, particularly around castle building. But Saladin just does what everyone else was doing better and faster, and that leads ultimately to a fall. Well, Nick, we'll wrap up the main podcast episode here, because there's so much more we could talk about, and we will do in future. And listeners, we will talk in detail in future episodes about things like, we will cover the Battle of Hattin in a full episode, because it's fascinating. I think we both have opinions on both the traditional view of how that battle comes about, and actually, when you look at it in detail, how much of that is true and how much isn't. But before we move on for extra subscribers to talking about castles and more, Nick, you've mentioned Crusader Storm. It's one of the reasons I wanted you on is precisely because I knew that you were the perfect person to help me hopefully get across to listeners just what this area was like. What else can people expect in the book?
Yes, so Crusader Storm is a history of the Crusades, from the First Crusade through to Saladin's siege of Jerusalem. But what makes it distinctive is that I'm looking at this history not just from the Crusaders' perspective, not just from a Muslim perspective, but from around 10 different cultural perspectives. I want to draw out just how many factions, individuals, and cultures are involved, including multiple Christian perspectives, multiple Muslim perspectives, also Jewish perspectives as well, because ultimately you can really only understand the evolution of events once those various different pieces are placed together. And the way I do it is that we work through the history of this region by looking at particular individuals, people caught up in the cut and thrust of the action. These might include an Antiochene princess, or the vizier of Egypt, or the mother of the Turkish ruler of Damascus, the empress of Byzantium, one of Saladin's generals, a Syriac archbishop, a young Arab nobleman. And the reason I'm doing this is that they can act like guides. I want to draw out just how fascinating and interconnected the region is. But at the same time, I want to use these individuals to guide you through the complexities of this region so that it's not just too many things going on at once. They can explain their own cultural perspective, or these individuals can serve as guides for their culture's perspective, and that way show how all these various different pieces come together.
I'm not going to drop any spoilers around this, but the Byzantine Empress thing is whatever you're expecting that one to be like, listeners. No, it's fascinating character
points there, yeah.
And a really good example of how things ripple and how odd ripples can have diplomatic effects elsewhere and the perspectives they provide. Well, thank you very much. We're going to carry on geeking about castles in a second. Main podcast listeners, we will leave you there. If you are absolutely desperate to hear about Crusader castles, and of course you are, why wouldn't you be? And also the bits that we didn't get time, some of the bits we didn't get time to talk about, there's way too much to cover in an extra bit normally. Then don't forget, you can go to untitled-history.com and you can subscribe to the podcast there. Subscribing and joining as a member, if you'd love join as an insider, not only do you help support the podcast, but you get your shout out at the beginning, as you heard here. But even just as a regular subscriber, gives you access to ad-free versions of the podcast, gives you access to all these extra bits, and also to the weird stuff I post on there. Like, you're going into the weekend and you want something weird to watch on YouTube, some weird old history documentary, chances are I've posted one on the shared community area you can watch. And just a final request as well, if you've enjoyed this episode, if you've enjoyed any of our episodes, then remember that because we are a general history podcast, because we try and bring you lots of different topics, it makes it really, really hard for the algorithms on things like Spotify or YouTube to know who to recommend us to and to get us into people's feeds. So do please comment on YouTube or on Spotify to say what you've enjoyed, what you haven't. That helps us get up in rankings. But also share the podcast with people you know who will enjoy it. If you know someone who's going to enjoy this episode, ping them a link on WhatsApp. Send them a tweet or a Blue Sky message or a Mastodon post. Share that you're enjoying the podcast. It really helps us spread the word and let people know that we're here and that we're covering everything from the vibrancy of Crusader States to the origins of ship's cats. But main podcast listeners, we'll leave you there. So it's to go a bit too Ronnies for the older members of the audience. It's goodbye from me. And Nick, do you want to say goodbye?
It's goodbye from me.
So hang around if you're an extra episode listener, and because we're going to talk a bit more about Crusader castles.
You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
And to help me explore that subject today on the pod is Nick. Sorry, I've just absolutely about to sneeze.
That's all right.
No, it's gone. Good.